Hello, beloved survivors. This is Autumn speaking. We know we said that we were going on break, and we are technically on break. But this week and next week's episodes, we couldn't wait to share with you. So we are dropping a couple of special episodes during our break, content that we feel like is incredibly important to the time that we're living through. And as soon as you start listening to today's episode, you'll understand why. Enjoy. I'm Autumn Brown, frontwoman of the eponymously named soul pop band Autumn, a queer science fiction writer, a theologian, a mother of dragons, and a healing justice facilitator for social movements living on Dakota and Anishinaabe land currently known as Minneapolis.
And I'm Adrienne Marie Brown, a luscious Black queer witch writer auntie, an apocalyptic cosmic optimist, and a gardener of healing ideas. I live in the land of the Shakori, Squirura, Tuscarora, and Lumbee peoples known as Durham, North Carolina.
Cosmic optimist, that's new.
I know, I thought I should add. I want to really affirm that I'm still looking up, even if it's like towards the heavens.
Hell yes. Okay. Yes. And this is How to Survive the End of the World.
Our podcast about learning from apocalypse with grace, rigor, and curiosity.
As a reminder, we have no ads. We are fully listener supported.
So join our Patreon for exclusive, and I mean hot tea exclusive content. Tell us who we have today. Oh my God.
As our solidarity season continues, we are having a very, very exciting conversation today with one of my favorite activist, organizer, thinker, artist people. And I'm so excited to introduce him to you. Our guest today is Roan Boucher. Roan is a movement artist, organizer, and consultant who I have had the pleasure of knowing and working closely with for nearly a decade. More on that in a moment. Well, yeah, we go back. Roan, whose children lovingly refer to as a tiny nerd with glasses. Roan became politicized as a teenager through queer, trans, and feminist anti-racist organizing and cut his teeth as an organizer in ACT UP, in immigrant justice, and in anti-war collectives. He spent many years wrestling with anti-capitalist questions about how to use, distribute, leverage money and resources. He worked with Resource Generation to organize young, lefty, rich / class privileged people to fight for wealth redistribution and reparations.
Not to white.
I mean, he worked with Bay Area-based Poor Magazine, a poor and indigenous people-led grassroots organization doing economic justice work through art, organizing, media, education, and multi-generational community building. In 2008, alongside Dean Spade, Roan co-founded the website Enough, the Personal Politics of Resisting Capitalism, an online space to share strategies for creating more just and economically sustainable movements and communities. In 2010, Roan co-founded Aorta, the Anti-Oppression Resource and Training Alliance, a worker-owned cooperative devoted to strengthening social justice movements and organizations through facilitation, training, consulting, coaching, and strategy. He spent 15 years co-creating Aorta and working with hundreds of community organizations, progressive nonprofits, co-ops, and student groups to build power and collective strategy for social change. That's where our paths intersected as I joined Aorta in 2016. Roan and I both just left Aorta right at the end of 2024 to follow our political and artistic passions. So we had the pleasure of getting to walk out the door arm in arm, trusting that our movement paths would continue to intersect. And with the outcome of the election and our solidarity season ongoing, I knew there was one person I really wanted us to talk to about the subject of Christian nationalism. So fun, which is what we're here to discuss today with Roan Boucher.
Yay.
So let's get into it. Roan, we're going to talk about Christian nationalism. And in preparing for this interview, I realized that I kind of have always thought that you just like woke up like this, like just knowing a weird amount about Christian nationalism. But obviously this came from extensive research. Your knowledge base came from years of study. And I'm wondering if, just to kick us off, if you can share a little bit about why you care about this subject and how you ended up getting so obsessed with it.
Yeah, I really didn't just wake up like this. And in fact, I think part of why I got so obsessed with it was because I spent so many years as a politicized person on the left without thinking very much about Christian supremacy or talking about the Christian right with people I was organizing with. Not that I wasn't aware of it, but I think I just honestly didn't factor that deeply into my political landscape analysis. And I think that's been a driver of how focused I am on learning about it, because I'm like, how did I miss this for so long? I have some theories about that we can maybe get into later, but I started thinking about it really through being a political educator for lefty organizations. That, like you said, Autumn, that was a big part of our work together in Aorta for many years. And central to that work is an analysis of systemic oppression as shaping, the institutions of society, government, the economy, and also our movements and organizations on the left in some ways. Talking about white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, capitalism. And I think when people describe these interlocking systems of oppression, Christian supremacy is often missing from the framework. So I was starting to make more of those connections in my pedagogy and approach as a political educator. And then the thing that really sent me barreling down the rabbit hole of learning a lot more specifics about Christian nationalism was a few years ago, in the process of fleshing out our political education offerings at Aorta. I started working on a training about queer and trans liberation. And I knew it wasn't going to be a training about etiquette and pronouns and cultural competency. That's kind of what people would often ask us for, but it's not really the kind of work we were doing. And I had done some other trainings that talked about neoliberalism as a force co-opting gay movements and talking about the difference between, challenging state violence versus being absorbed into it. And I knew that sort of framework around neoliberalism would have to be a part of this training. But I also was like, there's some new-ish stuff happening, or a new flavor, for a while now. And especially ramping up around 2020, we've been seeing these massive, this huge proliferation of legislative attacks on trans people. And as soon as I started to write about that, it just became very clear that there's no way to talk about the attacks on trans people without talking about Christian nationalism, because that's where the attacks are coming from. And actually, that's where most of the current political attacks on many communities are coming from, not only in the U.S., but definitely in the U.S. And I think that without understanding Christian supremacy, we can't fully understand the anti-trans oppression and political violence that's happening right now, but also we can't fully understand white supremacy, patriarchy, ableism, colonialism, climate collapse, any of the things our movements are fighting. The Christian right has always been present. The U.S. has always been a hegemonically Christian nation, but the current movement of Christian nationalists has been building power as a political force, especially over the past 50 years. So I started to learn more about that, and I learned so many things that I didn't know before. I started having conversations about it in the course of my work with organizations, thinking about how does Christian nationalism impact this organization's work, whether it's focused on food justice or climate justice or reproductive justice, arts and culture, queer and trans organizing, whatever it was. We can usually draw a pretty straight line to how the Christian right is directly impacting that work. And that can give us some insight on strategy, because we can't fight our opponent unless we understand them, at least in broad strokes. And also, to be honest, I just became really fascinated by these movements and trying to understand them. I'm fascinated by how compelling they are to so many people. I'm fascinated by how successful they've been and their strategy over decades. Yeah, I think there are things we can learn.
Thank you. I think words mean things, and we throw so many of them around, and I think people are like, oh, I hear these words or I hear these words combined. I know what that means. But we wanted to actually slow it down here to ground us and ground our listeners and make some distinctions. So, Roan, could you break down what is Christian nationalism? What is Christian supremacy? How are they related? How are they different? And can you share about if they do or don't fit into the left's analysis of the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be tricky to untangle because all of these things are it's this big tangled mess, you know, the Christian right, Christian nationalism, Christian supremacy. They're not the same thing, but they're very tangled up. So Christian supremacy is just, you know, like look around. Christian holidays are bank holidays. They're treated as if they're secular and universal. You know, our calendar is a Christian calendar. And God we trust is on our currency. One nation under God is in the Pledge of Allegiance. Which, by the way, when my kids started going to school, when my kids became like school age, I was like, they still have the kids saying the Pledge of Allegiance in schools? Like, face the flag, hand on heart. I remember doing that my whole childhood, but like, from an adult perspective, it seems so sinister.
It is so sinister.
It's so sinister.
Right? Yeah. It's very scary. So, you know, this country is really foundationally a Christian country. You know, this land was colonized by white Christian Europeans with Christianity as the justification. That's what the doctrine of discovery is. That's what manifest destiny is. You know, God said, we get all this. It says non-Christians aren't human. There are no Christians on this land. Therefore, it's vacant. And that's the same logic that Christian theology has used to justify slavery, colonization of other lands, witch burnings, crusades. You know, the expansion of Christendom has been used as a justification for conquest, you know, ever since the 300 CE, when the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity and made it the official religion of the Roman Empire, and then went, you know, empiring around, taking more land and doing what empires do. But back to the here and now, you know, some people might have heard of this idea in this country of the separation of church and state. It's that we supposedly have. It's in the First Amendment. You know, and we've never like strictly had that, you know, see like everything I just said. But there have been some gestures made towards like actual religious freedom in the U.S. But the current Christian nationalist political movement really wants nothing to do with the separation of church and state. They want the U.S. to be a Christian country, no caveats. That's what Christian nationalism is. And at the moment, as we enter this new Trump presidency, they're like riding the crest of the wave. You know, they are reaching or coming close to an apotheosis of a few decades of systematic power building, and they now control
like
every
they're speaking
branch
in
of government.
tongues.
Yes, they
like,
really are.
Nothing's making sense, but they're hearing each other.
They do hear each other, and they're really organized, and they control, especially significantly, the judiciary. And I also should say, like, before we get too deep into it, that this discussion, per your comment at the beginning, Adrienne, this is not about Christians broadly, right?
Yeah.
Like we should say a lot of Christians are actively working against Christian nationalism. You know, there are plenty of Christians in our movements that are about love and service, you know, about like a Jesus who is on the side of the poor and oppressed. Many Christian communities are about that. The Christian right is not about that. Christian nationalists are not about nice Jesus. They're about supremacy and authoritarianism and Armageddon and taking power as Christians really by any means necessary. So when I talk about the Christian right and Christian nationalists, I'm talking about a political movement that uses a very specific form of Christian theology and belief to forward its goals. So, I mean, in terms of how this analysis fits in on the left, you know, as I kind of implied earlier, my hot take, I don't know how hot it is, but that is that we on the left...
Make it as spicy as you can, Roan.
We've underestimated them for a while now.
Yeah.
You know, I think, and I think that's changing. It's becoming harder to ignore. I think the genocide in Palestine had a lot of people learning about Christian Zionism for the first time.
Yeah.
I think People know about Project 2025, which is the very concrete Christian nationalist playbook for this moment. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. In my experience, it hasn't always been built into our analysis. I'm curious about what y'all have experienced. Yeah, I think this really varies over different segments of the left. Like, is this something that you all find folks talking about a lot in your work?
It's deep. It's been a while since I was doing like frontline facilitative work, but in that period, if I think about like how are we holding Christianity period in that space, it was really like as a function of diversity. Like, oh, there's Christians here. Like, that's such a good sign that we've done our organizing well, that some Christians are here. But there was not a sense of like, as an organized body, that's what we're up against until around the 2003, 2004 election, like when Bush stuff was popping off, and there was like a real sense of like something's happening, like there's something happening there where they're starting to really not make sense, but they're being taken seriously by media and other folks, and there just started to be this like glitch in the matrix thing of like something is like, it felt like after a period, and maybe that's a cycle. Actually, as I'm saying it out loud, it might be like, everything was so Christian for so long, and then it felt like we had the 60s and 70s in this period of like diversifying and starting to really broaden how we think about the American project from a religious viewpoint. And then it feels like in the 80s, it was like, we don't even care about religion anymore. All we care about is money. And then it felt like now this thing was coming back around of like money has found a way to be money plus God, like deeply entrenched with each other and running everything. Mm-hmm. But it was, again, it was like still back. I was like, well, I don't know anything to do about that. The Christians are going to have to handle it, kind of, which is how I've held a lot of things, right? As I'm like, oh, if there's a problem happening within a community that other people are already organizing within, I often will be like, let me defer and we'll support as needed. But this feels like it's gone so far beyond all that. What about for you, Autumn?
Wow, this is really, really fascinating. Where my brain just went was that place, that gap between the what we might refer to as sort of the end of the civil rights movement, in the early 70s, and the at that point, the active killing or murder of many religious leaders within the civil rights movement.
Yes.
And a rapid secularization of, there's some connection I'm trying to make here between suppression of civil rights activity across the 80s and 90s and secularization of the civil rights movement and secularization of movement work broadly.
Yeah.
So that by the time I'm entering movement work in the late 90s, early 2000s, I'm entering at a point where there is a real schism within movements between religious people who do civil rights activities and everyone else on the left. That's what it feels
kind of like. They're the liberal sort of.
Right. As opposed to, that's not an integrated understanding that religious people have almost always historically been at the forefront of civil rights movements or like liberation, like religious people of various types of religions. But that, I think there's, to me, and I'd be curious to know, Roan, how much this intersects with the theory that you were referencing as to like, how did I miss this for so long? Like my conspiracy theory brain goes to like, what's the relationship between the secularization of the left and the secret act? I mean, not so secret, but what felt like a sort of sudden upsurge in hyper-nationalist Christian political activity that was also rooted in a very different, like from a theological standpoint, what I would say, one of the things that I see, one of the big differences I see in the narrative that Christian nationalists push is this what we call the prosperity gospel.
Yeah.
This notion that like accumulating wealth is a blessing from God and is an entitlement of
reframe. Wow.
Right. It's an entitlement of good Christian practice, which is, again, it's pretty disconnected from literally anything and everything Jesus ever taught.
Hypocritical.
But it's also disconnected from thousands of years of like religious teachings in Christianity. But it also there is a through line. There's a through line from, you know, the 1500s to now in terms of like these sort of like various kinds of religious schisms that were really trying to reckon with the relationship between money and land and blessing. And
That's right.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So not to get, I don't want to go too far off the rails on that, but I wonder about the relationship between this, like, the prosperity gospel coming forward so strongly amongst Christian nationalists as they're moving a political strategy that is about accumulating significant governing power, and then the secularization and erasure of religious leadership inside of liberatory movements.
Yeah, I think it's all so connected. You know, the prosperity gospel, meaning like being rich means God loves you and thinks that you should have lots of power.
Right.
That's what it means.
Right.
And that kind of theology within Christian nationalism is really powerful. And then I think, you know, there's so much to say about that period of the 70s because so much of this current religious right is the backlash to the civil rights movement and to feminism and to gay rights, right?
Yeah.
But also in terms of the secularization of the left, I think that's something I think about a lot. You know, I like maybe a lot of people on the left, I wasn't raised religiously. So now, you know, in my life now, religious or spiritual practice is a bigger part of my life. I'm Jewish. I'm pretty involved in my local Jewish lefty spiritual community, but I wasn't raised that way. But I was raised in this society, interfacing with institutions in which Christian beliefs and culture were totally normalized, right? Background noise. And I do think that for people, when I talk to people who were raised evangelical, you know, the thing that you were saying, Adrienne, about like they kind of stopped making sense. Like they do make sense to each other.
Yes.
And people who were raised in these communities can read between the lines. You know, they hear the dog whistles everywhere. They know when politicians are referencing Bible verses and what it means that they are.
Ooh,
right?
chale.
Yeah.
And they understand how serious it is, you know? I think also people who are raised religiously in a different religion than Christianity often really notice the Christianity that's everywhere in that way that people do when their culture isn't the dominant culture.
Yes.
But I think there's something about having constant exposure to Christian beliefs just normalized as the status quo, but not actually understanding the culture and community and theology of Christian nationalism. It makes it easy to kind of miss things that are hiding in plain sight. And I also think there's an anti-religious bias on the left, you know, consciously or unconsciously, that plays out in some complicated ways, like this idea that, quote, organized religion is fundamentally bad or oppressive. And I think a couple impacts of that. One is, I think because of Christian hegemony, people often filter their anti-religious bias through a Christian lens. Like when they think about organized religion, they're often thinking about organized Christianity. And they might not know a lot about non-Christian religions if they don't have personal experience with them. So it can play out in ways that are Islamophobic or anti-Semitic that perpetuate religious bias. I think about this like when I hear people say Judeo-Christian, which is a term that actually almost always just means Christian.
Yep.
And I think that bias also plays out in the idea that religious extremists on the Christian right are just kind of like ding-dongs. They're
such
ignorant.
a dangerous idea.
Yeah, that if you're, and it makes sense because if you're not in it, you know, the theology of Christian nationalists it's totally alien. It has to do with demons and the rapture and prophecies. It's a totally different reality than what people outside of that theology are living in. But it's not fringe. It's very internally coherent. And its leaders are really savvy and sophisticated. They're good organizers, you know? So as much as like there's a lot to kind of mock in the culture of Christian nationalists and like we deserve that maybe to do a little mocking, like we also have to really take it seriously too.
Wow.
Sister, do you want to go to history next?
Yeah. I mean, and we're kind of already on the precipice of this question, but we wanted to ask you, Roan, to speak a little bit more to the the history and ideology of Christian nationalism and how it, well, we're going to ask you to talk about how it impacts our movements for liberation. But maybe first, let's just stay focused on the history of this ideological movement.
Yeah. So I want to take us into the current shape of the movement, but I'll start by telling a story about the rise of Christian nationalism. This is a story that you'll often hear when people are describing the history of the present day Christian right. Maybe you know this story. It's about white evangelicals, about the anti-choice movement, and about school desegregation. Sound familiar? Okay.
Whoa.
So
here we go.
It starts in the 1970s. Because before the 70s, white evangelicals were not really politically organized. They leaned right politically, but they weren't necessarily a unified voting bloc about a lot of issues. They weren't politically mobilized. They were like, we go to church. We're not a political movement. So if we back up a little bit to Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, public schools were desegregated, a Supreme Court decision that a lot of white people famously hated. White evangelicals especially hated it. They felt like they had a God-given right to white supremacy, basically, and to having white-only schools. So what they did was they set up a whole bunch of Christian private schools that only admitted white students. And because they were Christian schools, church-affiliated, they were tax-exempt. So they go on this way for a couple decades. And in some places in the South, these Christian segregation academies, as they were known, they were so popular that all the white kids went there. And there are actually no white kids in the public schools, which, like, since we know how white supremacy works, means that black kids in those schools are getting a shitty education. We could do a whole sidebar here also about, like, comparisons to contemporary charter schools.
Whoa. I know. I was thinking, I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
Sidebar.
There's a lot to say, you know, and we see a billion examples of schools being a key site where these battles around Christian supremacy and racial justice tend to play out.
Hence CRT.
Exactly. So while these Christian segregation academies are proliferating, there are some lawsuits, mostly from black families, who are like, these racist schools shouldn't get to be tax exempt. And in the 70s, in response to one of these suits, the Supreme Court decided, you know, that you can't be tax exempt if you're segregated. And white evangelicals, like, burst into flames. They're like, hell no, we should get to practice segregation. We should get to have white-only schools. And the government should support us. And we should get to receive federal money for it. And that's religious freedom. So,
boom, boom, mic drop.
Yeah, put a little thumbtack in that definition of religious freedom, meaning, like, basically the freedom to restrict other people's freedom in the name of Christianity. That's how the right uses the concept of religious freedom.
The freedom to restrict other people's freedom is religious freedom.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
The freedom to oppress other people, control and exclude others. So white evangelicals are all stirred up about school desegregation. They're mad. They're going to fight back. But by this point, we're in the 1970s. Even though the country is deeply invested in white supremacy, just like now, it's less popular to say it out loud. So a bunch of white evangelical leaders, men, they're like, okay, guys, what's our angle here? You know, the historian Randall Ballmer has written a lot about this. These meetings are really well documented. And they involve some, like, longtime heavyweights of the Christian right, Jerry Falwell, the televangelist who founded the Moral Majority, Paul Weyrich, who co-founded the Moral Majority, also co-founded the Heritage Foundation, folks may know, are the architects of Project 2025, also co-founded the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is like one of these legislation factories that writes model legislation about how to repress groups they don't like and then, like, share it around to different state legislatures. So learning about the Christian right is just like a parade of terrible white men. So they're having all these meetings. They know school segregation was not the, you know, cause they're going to want to hang their hat on, because it wasn't going to be that popular to be explicit about their racist goals, but they wanted to tap into this energy of white Christians being mad at the government. So they're like, what issue can we mobilize people around that makes us look good and not just racist? This is like right-wing movement strategy. So,
and this is, like, documented that this was the kind of conversation that they were having.
Yeah, it's very well documented, and it shows up everywhere. I mean, this is one of those things where, like, once you start learning about this, you're like, and of course we're telling that story again. Wow. So they settle on abortion. And the background is, before this moment in the late 70s, and this is one of the things I didn't know until I started researching this, evangelical Protestants were, unlike today, not at all unified about being anti-choice. Being against abortion was considered more of a Catholic thing. And yeah, in fact, the Southern Baptist Convention had kind of come out in support of Roe v. Wade, which had been decided several years earlier with very little pushback broadly from evangelicals.
Yeah.
So Paul Weyrich, who was Catholic, by the way, and also a real bridge builder around getting white Protestant evangelicals and reactionary Catholics to be in coalition with each other.
Wow.
He's like, it's abortion, guys. We're going to be the defenders of the unborn. We're going to save those babies, and that's how we're going to mobilize people, and that's how we're going to have political power. It's the new civil rights movement. They love to co-opt language and rhetoric of civil rights and abolition. That's like really how they talk about it.
And all language. They love
And
co-opting.
yeah.
I was like, they really love
Truly.
taking it. Yeah.
And it worked, you know. I mean, they didn't get to keep their segregated Christian schools, although, you know, like see sidebar about charter schools. And also another sidebar about Christian homeschooling. But they got Reagan elected. And they kept going. They kept building power. And now we're here. So the end of that story. Really just the beginning.
I really appreciate this background, Roan. Like, it helps to sort of be like, oh, like, these things were intentional. And I think there's something in what you're saying that's like the fact that we weren't taking stuff seriously because you're like, oh, we can dismiss that, we can ridicule that. I think part of what has been, you know, I think this has been the case with so many rhythms, right? Where I remember several friends of mine being like, something's up with the men. Like, and I was just like, well, it's ridiculous. Like, they just want to go backwards, but it's like, it's not ridiculous to them. They're taking it very seriously and they're feeling very like dismissed. And I think, and then there's also this sense of like, well, there are men and it's a real thing. And I feel like that here where folks are like, I think a lot of people get pulled into this because they're like, well, Christianity means this. It means kindness. It means goodness. It means caring for your neighbor. It means community. It means being in right relationship with God. And so I think it's really hard when people hear Christian nationalism or Christian supremacy to really think, oh, those are the baddies. You know, like there's something in the dismissal. I wanted to ask you where Christian Zionism fits into this, because I feel like a lot of this past year and a half of working on genocide issues in Palestine, part of what just really not surprised me, but what really, there's moments when I'm like, I can't follow the hypocrisy contortion thing that's happening. Like, I can't understand how these people are on the same stage together. I can't understand how these people are at the same march together. Yeah. And I feel like Christian Zionism was a place where that showed up majorly this year, where I was like, you're looking at children being blown apart and you're going and standing on a stage talking about how that is God's will. And, you know, can you help us piece that in, especially for this particular moment and like this election cycle, this, you know, this economic moment where we're sending, I feel like Christian nationalism is part of how we can justify as a nation sending so much money to Israel right now. Yes. It all feels plugged together or knotted together.
It's very knotted together. I've heard it described by Jonathan Brenneman and maybe others as Christian Zionism is the foreign policy of Christian nationalism. Christian Zionism, as folks may know, it's a Christian movement to support Jewish nationalism in the modern state of Israel. And the basic theology of Christian Zionism is that, according to biblical prophecy, all the Jews need to be in Palestine. They don't call it that. So the second coming will happen. And when the second coming does happen, all those Jews will die, along with every other non-Protestant, or they'll convert to Christianity. So it's not like good news for the Jews, although Christian Zionists and Jewish Zionists, like you're saying, are all the time working together because their immediate goal is the same, for Jews to control that land. So the Christian Zionist view on Jews is pretty anti-Semitic. It's pretty like, we're going to use you to get what we want and then you're going to burn up. The Christian Zionist view on Palestinians is even more dehumanizing. They're an obstacle. They have no role to play in the rapture. So the sooner and more completely they're out of the way, the better for the Christian Zionist project. That's the ideology.
Wow.
Wait, and can we just get into this a little bit? When the rapture, like I feel like I learned about this as a kid, like the rapture is going to come. And I remember, it's like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and the rapture is coming. What are folks like when the rapture comes, we're going to get this? Like, what is the win? What is the victory that they achieve when the rapture comes? Just so we're like, know what they're looking at.
Never-ending life.
Well, yeah. Here's one thing that I've learned is that like even like evangelical Christians are not in agreement on exactly what happens around the rapture. There's like a lot of different there's a lot of different ideas about what will happen.
Let's just say the book of Revelation is not super clear.
Yeah, there's a lot of interpretation.
I'm like, because this is part of why I'm asking this, because I'm like, when I read that, I was like, bad. Like, let's not rush towards that. And so I'm like, how are you getting millions of people to be like, we need to rush towards that and put all of our money to get to there?
So I'll tell you one version. The rapture comes, people zoop up to the sky, heaven, to meet with Jesus. And while they're up there, the tribulation happens. The tribulation is not good. It's a very bad time for 7 years. And this is when everybody, is going to die and burn up in the pits of the lakes of fire and whatnot.
Okay.
And then Jesus comes down and rules on earth for a millennium. That's one version.
Okay.
There's a lot of people who are like, maybe we do get to be in the tribulation in some way, or some people are like, I don't think the rapture is actually going to happen like that. There's a lot of debate. I've spent maybe a little bit of time on Christian Reddit groups to kind of be like, someone explain this to me. It's not making sense.
Yeah.
But I think so. A couple of things. One, this ideology shapes so much of the U.S. Middle East policy and domestic policy, right? Because Christian Zionists are very interested in rebranding anti-Semitism to mean supporting Palestinian liberation. So then you get everything that comes from that, like the criminalization of protest, mask bans, this proposed bill saying nonprofits that support Palestine are terrorists and don't get to be nonprofits anymore. You get Project Esther, which is also from the Heritage Foundation. This goes hand in hand with Project 2025. It says it's about fighting anti-Semitism, but it's actually only about attacking and criminalizing support of Palestine. And there's almost no Jews involved. It's a totally backwards, bizarro world Christian version of fighting anti-Semitism, where Jews opposing genocide are the enemy and literal white supremacist anti-Semites are allies. We're all very familiar with this characterization of anti-Semitism. So Christian Zionism plays a really huge role in shaping U.S. support of Israel. It's why Trump moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem.
Right.
It's why Christians in the U.S. are raising millions of dollars for Israeli settlements in the West Bank. It's why Trump picked Mike Huckabee to be the U.S. ambassador to Israel. Mike Huckabee is an extreme Christian Zionist who said Palestinians don't exist. Mm-hmm. And, of course, Jewish Zionism also plays a really big role, obviously in Israel, but also in the U.S. Jews are really institutionally organized around supporting Israel, just with really different plans for the outcome. Mm-hmm. There are just way fewer Jews than there are Christian Zionists.
Right.
Not to excuse the role of Jewish Zionism, but just to emphasize that Christian Zionism, which I think is less known, has a bigger impact on U.S.-Israel policy.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one really important thing to take in, going back to this idea of the rapture, is this is an ideology that is very focused on the end times, and so is Christian nationalism. We can talk about that too. Okay. This is an ideology that fundamentally relies on violent mass death, theologically, right? Autumn, you referenced the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
Christian Zionists are really into the book of Revelation. It's the last book of the Christian Bible. It's about the apocalypse. And the way that it's described, there will be rivers of blood. Horrible, horrible suffering, killing, devastation. And that is what they are driving toward. Like you said, that is what they want.
But they just don't think they'll be in that death.
That's right.
They're like, this is what we've got to get to so that all these people that are in our way can just die already.
Exactly. It happens to other people, not to people who have accepted Jesus. It's the other people, the heathens, the demonized, the Palestinians, all the Jews who like stubbornly, foolishly haven't realized Jesus is the Messiah, they're all going to die. And it's so intense to consider how much they want that, right?
Yeah.
To hold a vision of a utopic future of heaven that relies on that. And so they look at the utter the devastation and violence and mass killing in Palestine, and they're like, this is good news. Like, things are looking good for us. The signs are happening, you know?
Wow.
There go the 4 horsemen. Like, it's time to get excited. The rapture is not. They really think the end times are happening soon. You know, it's a lot of like, it could be any minute now. And it's just very intense to take in. But it's really, really deep. This like eschatology, end times orientation informs so much of Christian nationalism.
Roan, you're helping me make a connection also around climate collapse.
Yes.
That's right.
And climate catastrophe. I just wrote this down. I wrote down what you said theologically. This movement theologically relies on violent mass death. And then I wrote, climate collapse is not an existential threat to their end goal. In fact, it's critical to their end goal, most likely.
That's right.
And I just kind of want to take a beat and have us all take a breath together.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, we are up against. I mean, I'm remembering when I was. I mean, it's so wild that this is what's coming back to me in this moment. But I remember when I was doing food justice organizing up in central Minnesota. There was a evangelical Black organizer that I was partnering with. And I remember when I said, I was saying something to him about the climate related work that we were doing. And he looked at me with this big smile on his face and he said, the flood's going to come. And I remember being, it was one of those moments as an organizer where I was like, I'm out of my depth. Something else is happening inside of this interaction. He's referencing something that I'm not, and he's referencing it as though I know what he's talking about, and I'm not clear what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And now, you know, I mean, it took me a couple of years, and now even more so, I feel like I'm feeling into the like, right, the idea that someone could meet the reality of impending climate collapse with joy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it helps. It helps to think of that and to also feel this tenderness of like all, you know, we grew up not in I would say in a Christian household, not in an evangelical household.
Right.
So we grew up in going to non-denominational churches, a lot of times with fairly progressive pastors, because it was such a diverse, you know, the military is such a diverse working space. So the folks who are going to be in those congregations, it tended to be a pretty diverse body of people. But I remember visiting our Southern family and going to a church service with one of my aunts and hearing the fire and brimstone and the punitive nature and the judgmental nature, the homophobia. Like, I mean, it was just like one thing after another that I was like, wow, I'm so confused by this. But it's like, if you've grown up in that and that's what you're hearing every single day, and that's what your parents believe, you know, it's just, it feels like, oh, we're in a place where so many people have been convinced that to not hold on to this world at all and to be rushing through life trying to get as much harm done as possible in the name of God. And and you know, I don't know why, but this, I mean, it's clicking all these boxes, right? I'm like, and this, the first person shooter games and the like, it's the normalization of violence, like all this, you know, I always think about that I'm like, oh, sex is so forbidden where violence is so embraced by so many of these cultures. And I don't really have a question. I'm just like, whoa, you know, like ding, ding, ding.
Yeah. And I mean, we can talk a little bit more about kind of what the current, like there are so many overlapping and intersecting and entangled communities and theological streams around Christian nationalism. But I think just to do a little bit of an overview and unpack where people are coming from, to some extent, the Christian nationalist movement right now, it includes a lot of Protestant evangelicals, many denominations, including non-denominational, also some reactionary Catholics, and they organize a broad base of Christians in churches and also in parachurch organizations, which are like these organizations that work in and around churches and to kind of get around that thing where churches aren't supposed to conduct political activities. But they organize a broad base of people towards a much more narrow consolidation of power. They're incredibly well funded. They're really well connected. They're really organized. It's worth saying, like, a lot of their most mainstream institutions are designated as hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center, including like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a hugely influential legal advocacy and training group, which was like behind the overturning of Roe v. Wade. They're really into trying to criminalize, being gay or trans. They're working hard on that right now.
Yeah.
But this is something that I want to talk about because it's, I think, an important piece of the puzzle that maybe a lot of people don't know about. So one of the fastest growing and currently very influential Christian nationalist religious political groups is called the New Apostolic Reformation. Have you heard of this? So the New Apostolic Reformation, let's call them the NAR. They are a Christian nationalist movement where leaders are considered modern day prophets and apostles, meaning they speak directly with God, basically. So this is a movement of charismatic Christianity, not charismatic meaning like they have a compelling personality, but charismatic Christianity is a form of Christianity based on the supernatural presence of the Holy Spirit in everyday life. So like prophecy, signs and wonders, miracles.
Speaking in tongues,
yes. Demons figure very heavily into the NAR. Pentecostalism is a form of charismatic Christianity, but the NAR isn't Pentecostal per se. They're kind of anti-denomination.
Okay.
So the NAR has very centrally this idea of dominionism, meaning that people of this belief system should control every area of society. They're called by God to do so. Dominionism is really core to Christian nationalism. And they talk about this in terms of the 7 mountains. And each mountain represents a political or cultural area they're trying to control. So family, religion, education, media, arts and entertainment, business, and government. And this movement and sort of associated movements of charismatic evangelicalism have really taken off, spread very quickly around the country and also internationally. They were some of the key folks involved in the January 6th Capitol riots. And there are a lot of NAR-aligned folks in government, including like new Trump appointees, but also people who've been around a while, like people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, also Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House. These people with a ton of power. The Speaker of the House is like second in line to succeed the president, who are openly theocratic, openly extremist. Mike Johnson, by the way, used to be a lawyer for the Alliance Defending Freedom. He's a proponent of conversion therapy. He's in a covenant marriage, which is like a type of marriage for Christians who don't believe in no-fault divorce, which is another thing that Christian nationalists hate.
Damn.
Yeah. So anyway, the NAR
like, the tea is too hot about Mike Johnson.
The NAR was founded in the 80s or 90s by this guy called C. Peter Wagner. He died in 2016, but he and his wife Doris were big organizers in this movement. I listened to an interview with Peter Wagner from 2011 on Fresh Air with Terry Gross. And, in an NPR context, he's really toning down some of the rhetoric. He's like, it's not that we think other religions are bad and shouldn't exist. It's just that they're of the kingdom of darkness. He's like, it's not that we think all Democrats or homosexuals are controlled by demons. It's just that they might be. And so this is like, it's very, they start off this interview. Terry Gross is asking him, she's like, I heard this thing that went viral where you said that the emperor of Japan had sex with the sun goddess and that's why there was a tsunami. And he's like, yeah, Terry, like let me break it down for you. You know, but it's this kind of thing where if you're coming from the outside, you're like, what?
Yeah.
But on the inside, their whole ideology is to do with demons. They think that regions of the globe are controlled by specific demons, and they have to cast them out. There's a lot of casting out of demons. Actually, Peter Wagner's wife, Doris, is a decades-long deliverance minister, which is like an exorcist. So they do a lot of this, like, we've got to identify where the demon lives, who it is, and we're going to bring people there to cast it out.
Okay,
so,
wait,
yeah.
Roan, can I ask you a question here? How
Yeah.
is Trump not seen as a demon? Like even by their worldview, like based on how he has moved politically, how he's moved with women, how he's moved with his money, like how is he not how he, all the felonies and all of this stuff, like to me, I'm like, this is a very real question. I really want to understand. It's like, how is he someone that wouldn't buy their, like, what set of, are they not looking at the 10 Commandments anymore? Or like, what's going on where someone like him isn't like, oh, that's a demon? Like, instead, they're like, he's our anointed person who's something, like, how?
Right. Well, I'm so glad you asked. It's a very good question. So this style of charismatic Christianity, because they are led by people who identify themselves as prophets, they can kind of decide that whatever fits into their political agenda is godly. And that's how they make sense of Trump, who's not an evangelical, like you said, by any sort of mainstream Christian standard, is like a wicked sinner. But he gives them what they want. And what they say about Trump is that he's God's instrument.
Wow.
He's imperfect, but he's God's instrument. There's a whole set of ideas around this. They compare him to a biblical king, Cyrus of Persia, who brought the Jews out of exile and enabled the rebuilding of the temple. Cyrus was a pagan, but he was a tool in the hands of the Lord, just like Trump.
This is very helpful to me. This is so helpful because I'm really trying to understand. But I'm like, part of why I'm like, it helps so much to just slow down and be like, okay, rather than dismissing this and rather than just hearing it as noise and rather than just hearing it as something to be terrified of, like, how can I understand what's actually happening and how people who, I mean, I know just so many people who are like, yeah, my mom, my dad, my grandmother, my uncle, my cousin are going down these paths and really believing that he's chosen by God for, I'm like, how? Okay, so a pagan chosen by God, like, okay. And because they were also very comforted, because I'm like, oh, we're having these different, when he was like, this is the last election, you're not going to have to worry about these anymore. And I'm like, that strikes the fear of God into anyone who's actually trying to focus in a democracy or practice a democracy. But it didn't seem to do that. It seemed to galvanize these other folks who are like, right, because we're on the Revelations pathway.
We're on the end times journey.
Yeah.
Got it.
Right.
Yeah. A lot of Christian Trumpism is led by charismatic prophets who are like on YouTube being like, God told me. I mean, and that's how you get January 6th in a lot of ways, right? Is because they're like, God said this. And so they are very focused on it.
Got it.
I'm wondering, with the specific surge in legislation that's about criminalizing trans folks specifically, but also like LGBTQ folks generally, I'm wondering, from your assessment, Roan, would you say that that's a part of the end times ideology, or is that more of a tactic for mobilizing people? Or is it somewhere in between those two things?
I think it's different for different Christians. I think for some Christians it is part of end times because, like I said, there are different conceptualizations of what the end times look like. And some Christian nationalists are like, we need to bring on the second coming of Jesus by like making God's kingdom on earth. And so we've got to get rid of all the sinners, right? And this is really like when I talk about the New Apostolic Reformation and these kinds of charismatic evangelicals, they're they think that anyone who they politically disagree with is controlled by demons.
Right.
Peter Wagner was like, the technical term is demonized. So this is like, there's this idea. And this is also just like a long time moral panic that has existed on the Christian right that is, kind of like the abortion issue. It's like a wedge issue where we can stir up people around these deep feelings. Trans people are a threat to my family. There's a war on unborn babies. And then we can use that to force through more right-wing legislation and lawmakers. It's a wedge. It's not like a lie. They really do hate trans people and also women, but it also accomplishes all of these other things. And by the way, a lot of these Christian right moral panics are also like crossover hits, I mean, there's all these examples of TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, as we call them, working with these major right-wing Christian groups like the Heritage Foundation and the Alliance Defending Freedom, right, to hate gay people, which a lot of them are, because they want to attack trans rights. Like there's a lot of crossover around anti-vax movements, radicalize a lot of crunchy yoga moms to the Christian right, often through these conspiracy theories like QAnon. QAnon also utilized like these largely fabricated memes about child trafficking to radicalize people to the right.
Right, and pedophilia and all that.
Yeah, and there's a lot of common rhetoric around these moral panics, right? Like save the children is a big theme. Save the children from vaccines or abortion or public education, gender, knowing about gay people, knowing about racism, right? And it's like, it's but really not
actually
about
being
children.
Killed.
Yeah, right. Totally.
Wow. Okay.
Wow. Okay.
So I'm gonna land us with our last question. Which you've I feel like you've really been speaking again to this all along, but inspire us, Roan. I'm curious to know your assessment. Why are they winning and how do we fight them?
Why are they winning? I have a lot to say about. How do we fight them? We're going to work on that one together. So first of all, like they're very unified, right? Even though it's not just one church or one denomination, they're unified by some really core principles and ways of organizing. They love authoritarianism, for example. That's how they structure the family, right? Parenting, marriage, it's how they structure church leadership, how they structure a lot of their organizing. It's very authoritarian, sometimes almost militaristic. It's really like nothing we want to use as a model for any of our organizing, but it's gone the Christian right pretty far. Here's another thought that I've had. The institutions of power that they're trying to take over in many ways are built to forward goals such as theirs. Right. So like the things that Christian nationalists want are just kind of turned up versions of the status quo in a society that's shaped by Christian white supremacist patriarchal values and beliefs. They might be talking about demons and prophecies, but they're doing it in the service of things like controlling women's bodies, oppressing people of color, punishing queer and trans people, generating massive wealth for a few people, which are things that this country like already loves and which like our institutions are kind of already built for, Right. Christian nationalists wouldn't necessarily agree with that. That's like part of what January 6th tells us. Like they want to topple some institutions, but I would argue that institutions like policing and the military and carceral systems and capitalism, like the authoritarian goals of the Christian right really smoothly fit into those. Those institutions already have a ton of power, and they're never going to serve the goals of the left, but they do serve the goals of the Christian right, I think. But then, okay, here's the thing I think about maybe the most. Because they are driven by this spiritual war between good and evil, between, demons and angels, God and Satan, it is a war for souls in which the earth doesn't matter, like we said, in which bodies don't really matter. It doesn't matter how many people have to die or be physically harmed in the here and now, because this is a battle for the afterlife, for the kingdom of heaven. And that's an epic battle. It's really something people can commit to, And what they've been able to so successfully do is to combine people's community and family and spiritual home with their political project. They are exactly the same. Spiritually, people want the U.S. to be a Christian government because that is how they win the spiritual war. The spiritual project and the political project are the same. And also, like y'all are saying, they're out there doing embodied practice, we talk about embodied practice, and on the Christian right, they are speaking in tongues, they're laying on hands, they're doing exorcisms, it doesn't get much more embodied than that. There's a documentary that came out in like 2006 called Jesus Camp. It was pretty critically acclaimed.
I watched that.
And it focused on some new apostolic reformation centered people and a camp that like brings kids and basically trains kids to be like political organizers for anti-choice movements and things like that, but does it through these incredibly like embodied prayer services where they're testifying and speaking in tongues, and you just see this footage of these kids, like young kids, just with their arms out, like looking up, just tears running down their face, speaking in tongues, like it's scary because it's kids. But when you look at, these huge mega church services where people are doing this, I don't know, maybe why I'm so fascinated by it is because there's like something in me where I'm like, that looks fun. It seems cathartic. It seems really moving to the people who are in it.
Yeah.
I think it's meeting these really fundamental needs that people have. And that's like what gets people in so deep.
I think someday maybe there's a whole nother conversation to have, because I think about this like, that's the experience I had at a Prince concert. That's the experience I have at a Beyonce concert. That's the experience some people have at sports or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's like, where are there healthy places to have that like mass orgasmic, surrender feeling experience? And then where are places where it's like you're having that experience so that you can be manipulated out of power, manipulated out of your money, manipulated out of, your life, your freedom.
Yeah. So maybe that's part of it, right? Like, how do we do more of that on the left? Like, without being a cult, we can't be everyone's spiritual home because we have a wide range of spiritual and religious practices that we encompass. But, I often am like, the stakes are very high for us too. We also have existential stakes because the policies of the Christian right are killing people, but also because of ecological and structural collapse. And I think that's really hard to look at. And I think people experience some bleakness around looking at that. And sometimes I'm like, if we could just like, what is the power of looking directly at what we are facing and feeling it, but feeling it together and being able, the thing that we started off saying about like everything is on fire and we are also trying to live and be connected and feel pleasure and joy and have community. And I'm like that. I don't know how else to do it but that, to make movements that give people something like that.
Right. And there is something too about one of the things that I really hear, and as you both know that I've been deeply working on this and thinking about this in my fugitive practice study, but I've been thinking a lot about the decentering of the individual as a core component of a deeply spiritual practice that actually invites more spaciousness to act and have agency around liberatory work. And what's interesting is that's the other thing I hear inside of this, inside of this theology that really distorts the relationship to life on earth. There is a decentering of the individual, like your individual life does not matter because, or your individual physical life does not matter because it's actually your eternal soul that we're orienting to. And to me, it feels complicated to say out loud and to be in the experiment of, but this has been like the thought experiment for me around fugitivity is like that similarly people who made themselves fugitive, particularly inside of the period of enslavement, but inside of many liberatory movements over time, there was a process of ego death that you had to undergo in order to be able to truly act as though you are free, right? You have to release the very individualized, individual sense of attachment to your own embodied life, right? And that to me feels like one of the missing pieces inside of, or the argument I feel like I would make is that that's one of the missing pieces inside of movement right now because we are hyper individualized and very attached to our embodied existence.
I know that we're winding down here, and it's so interesting because this week before I quite landed what we were going to be talking about, I wrote this poem about Jesus that I feel like would be a good place to land this conversation.
Oh, Jesus poem!
A Jesus poem. All right, so this poem, it doesn't really have a title yet, but I think you'll understand what it's about. Fine then, we're coming for Jesus. You don't want him, the poet of the desert, the winemaker, kingbreaker, beloved of the meek? A gift, perhaps too holy to hold, but we want the story he told. You hate those he loves, those he bid you protect. You reject what he made manifest. There is never room at your inn. You call his mercy sin. You would incarcerate him, shackle him, deport him, punish him, murder him again and again and again. Keep your God of vengeance, your loophole commandments, your guns, your corruption, your crosses, using God's name in every crime. Your shame cannot be sated. Let me make it plain. You call us sacrilege when you have no faith. So no, we are reclaiming each child of God and all this luscious garden of snake, tree, and flesh. Leading like Harriet and Gilgamesh, we cut loose from your chaos of fans. We know sweet Jesus, praise with both hands, and we need a body to swallow. To remember blood is binding. Stain our hearts with courage, kindness, and unconditional love. Let us wander and gather like Jesus. Let the desert be enough. And we place him in a circle without subterfuge or knives. Divine peers to kiss his cheeks. Divine ears to hear him repeat, be love, be love. It's enough, my brief life, enough. We make it enough from the dirt and seed. Such miracle is all we need. We wash the road from the workers' feet. We offer them peace and something to eat.
Woohoo!
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you,
I was
sister.
like, I think that part of our strategy is going to be this split, right? Of being like, there's Jesus. God sent Jesus. If you believe in this, if you grew up learning this, God had all that vengeance, bloody time, and then sent Jesus. And I'm like, that's actually the evolution. And you're being dragged backwards even through your own text. Like, anyway.
Right, because Genesis God looked real different.
I was like, Genesis God was heck different.
Genesis God is so funny to me because Genesis God is like basically like, oh no, I don't like that.
I don't like that.
I don't like that.
Yes.
None of that.
Thank you, Adrienne. That
Jesus
was
is like, let me wash
offering.
those feet and talk to you.
Shake these bones, oh God.
Thank you, Roan, for helping us arrive there. Thank you also for being such an incredible, knowledgeable, brilliant
Teacher.
guest. Thank you for
Yes.
all of the wisdom
So
that you
good to talk to
imparted.
you.
Truly, we are, what a gift, what an absolute
Yes.
gift to our movements. You are and have always been. I want to say, I want to also really highlight, Roan is a longtime movement artist. And so even if you've never heard Roan's name before, you almost certainly have seen Roan's work hanging in your punk rock coffee shops, hanging in your local community bookstores. Like, look around. You will start to notice Roan Boucher is everywhere and has been for 20 years.
Secretly, my work.
Secretly.
Look around. Okay.
Thanks for listening to our show. We're on Instagram at End of the World PC. We're also on Facebook at End of the World Show. We're also migrating to Blue Sky. Lots of things.
Yeah, I was going to say, we're not on, I don't think we're on Facebook anymore. I think we, but I do think, we're trying to move from the meta Muskyverse over to places that are more liberated.
It's everywhere.
You can make a sustaining donation to our show by visiting the page at patreon.com/endoftheworldshow.
Another incredible thing you can do to help our show sustain itself is to write us a review on Apple Podcasts if you're an iPhone person. This helps people looking for good new content to find us, and we're really trying to get to 2,000 reviews by, what's the date did we decide?
Tomorrow.
By tomorrow. Let's go.
Yeah, stop waiting
busy.
around. If you like this, go make the thing. Do it now. Another incredible thing that you should know is that our podcast is produced and edited by the sweet European boy, Zach Rosen. Is it okay to call him that because he lives in
He's
Europe
not
now?
a European boy.
I know, but he lives there now. Okay, so the transcripts are in our show notes and on our website at intotheworldshow.org.
Music for today's show comes from Autumn, the band, Tunde Alaniran, Mother Cyborg, and the Bangsons.
Plentiful.
Boom, we landed it.